Can you say more about that? That would be interesting. That idea.
He's an amazing person. Well, you know his history, but which was incredible. But it went on until his last days. He never stopped. I learned a lot from him about Yugoslavia, just talking to him. But then we were involved in all kind of other things together. He was very active in the international anti-war movement in the 1960s. He was a very serious kind of dissident. You know, he understood the complications of the situation that he was protesting. He wasn't just trying to make friends with people, you know, powerful people in the West and so on. And he had a very sensible, critical analysis and very engaged. He was, you know, as you probably know, he and his wife were both seriously wounded in the war. They were partisans, and he had plenty of later problems. One of his sons was murdered, probably by Tito, but I don't think they ever proved anything. But he just kept at it right to the last minute.
Once, I think it was during the 70s, you made a reference to the self-governing socialism.
I was very interested in that, and I was in touch, pretty close touch with the Belgrade group at the time. They've changed a lot since, but they were the Praxis group and others, and I read a lot of material. I have plenty of it over there, in fact, on the self-management experiments, which are pretty interesting to me. There were problems with them. They were in the framework of an authoritarian structure, but if you abstract from the structure that should have been dismantled in many ways, I think they were doing important things.
What do you think? There is still much debate and much controversy over the reasons and real causes of the dissolution of Yugoslavia. So certainly there are internal and external factors that led to that. And internally, a lot of people argue, and I think it's accurate that basically it's primarily the responsibility of the political elites in all Yugoslav republics and also intellectuals who just saw in nationalism a kind of new ideological fuel. But what?
I mean, I don't claim any special expertise in this, but for what it's worth, the way it looked to me was different. But rather along the lines of what Susan Woodward described. First of all, there was the effect of Tito's death, of course. Then there was the effects of the neoliberal policies instituted by the usual triumvirate, the IMF, the World Bank, U.S. Treasury Department, all over the world. And all over the world, including the Western countries, they had pretty much the same effects in different countries. So if you go down to the Occupy Wall Street today, they're protesting the impact of these programs on the United States. If you go to Tahrir Square in Egypt, they're protesting the impact on Egypt, which was of course different. It's a different country, but similar in many respects. And it was the same around the world. Latin America, for example, which the countries that observe the rules most stringently were South America and Sub-Saharan Africa, and they're the ones who suffered most, which have lost decades of growth and development. South America's pulled out of it. In fact, they've rejected it all and are now progressing. Europe, it's being imposed now, in a way. The austerity programs being imposed by the World Bank, by the ECB, this is European Central Bank, and German banks, and so on. Incidentally, the IMF is no longer approving of them, but they're similar to the kinds of programs, you know, in many ways were employed, and they're having the same effect. It's a form of class warfare, undermining welfare states, you know, making sure banks are rich enough, undermining the role of labor. Pretty standard effects. And in Yugoslavia it was the same. They were either accepted or were subjected to, it depends how you look at it, structural adjustment type programs in the 1980s, which undermined a lot of the achievements of the society, I thought. and also had the usual effects of centralizing wealth and power, harming the general population, eliminating state structures, many of which were beneficial, many not. And the poster child for this, the person who the West just loved more than anyone else, was Milosevic. He was a great neoliberal advocate, and so I think right up till 1990 probably he was a real favorite of the West because of the policies he was pursuing. There was the nationalism is an interesting phenomenon. I mean, I don't remember the exact details, but if you look at polls throughout Yugoslavia, say around 1990, there was still, I think, considerable majority support for keeping the Federation together. It started to break up when, I think we know the sequence of events. We can ask about the internal dynamics, but Slovenia declared independence. That wasn't much of an issue. They were pretty much part of Central Europe anyway. So, okay, a couple of days of conflict that sort of went over smoothly.
And nationally pretty homogenic. It's
and it's sort of, it's part of, it's like Austria.
Yeah.
So yes. But the big move was Croatia. Croatia declared independence. There's a lot of memories there for the rest of Yugoslavia, Serbia particularly. I don't have to go through it, but it was immediately backed by Germany, which raises more memories. The Nazis and the Croatian fascists were very closely linked, and Germany was plainly just trying to expand its influence over traditional areas where it had been dominated. Germany's support for Croatian independence paid no attention to the rights of the Serbian minority, which was pretty big. I think it was about a third of the population. So quite naturally, the Yugoslav army entered, and that led to the first of the conflicts. Actually, some of the first atrocities were by Croatians. And as I said, there's plenty of baggage there, historical memories, which I don't have to go into. The big question was how Europe would respond. Europe went along with Germany, which it usually does. It's the motor of Europe, which meant that they were supporting breakup and certain conflict. Then, the internal conflicts broke out. The U.S. first was standing aside, and in fact even supporting some steps towards unification. There were proposals in, I guess, 1992, Benzo and Lisbon, which could probably have resolved the conflict more or less, not in a pretty way, but without the atrocities that followed. And the U.S. at that point entered in and undermined them. Apparently, Washington wanted to have a peace of the action and not leave it to Europe. So it entered and it had to have somebody support. So it supported the Bosnian, that Clinton pretty much urged Izetbegovic not to accept the settlements that were being proposed, which are incidentally not very different from the way it ended up. After all the crimes and horrors, so very likely it could have been put together right at that point. And then followed what we all know, just more and more violence, conflict. Current estimates are careful estimates for Bosnia, I think, are about 100,000 killed, maybe 60,000 Bosniaks, and so on, which is pretty bad. A lot of atrocities, a lot of crimes, always. Everyone knows about Srebrenica, but nobody knows about the Krajina expulsions at about the same time, the biggest ethnic cleansing in all of Yugoslavia. But the U.S. was, or behind it, was Croatian, so therefore it's okay, forget about it. But that's the usual story. But finally, militarily, it was, the lines were more or less drawn after Srebrenica and Krajina. And so the U.S. stepped in and
monitored the agreements, which essentially ratified what was there. And as I say, I think it probably could have been done in 1992. And then comes more conflict. Finally, we get to 1999, the next big step. And Kosovo had a very strong nonviolent resistance, guerrilla resistance, which I think had just questioned whether they should have taken part in the elections. They decided not to. If they had taken part in the elections, they probably would have voted Milosevic. They had enough votes to carry it, I think. Can't be sure it looked like it. They didn't. By 1998, it had moved to a pretty violent uprising. KLA forces were attacking from across the border from Albania. But they made it pretty clear that what they were trying to do was to provoke a violent Serbian response, which they could then appeal to the West with. And that went on. We know very well what happened. That's more than almost any other conflict in the world. After October 1998, when there was a formal agreement, there were monitors on the ground. The Kosovo, KSV, I forgot what it stood for. There's a Kosovo verification mission. The international monitors were all over. They were sending back tons of reports. We have very rich documentation. The two major collections of State Department documents, the British Parliamentary Inquiry, there's NATO documents, the United Nations, and they all say about the same thing. There was a steady level of conflict. A typical cycle, according to them, was raids, often across the border by KLA guerrillas, violent killing Serbian soldiers, civilians, others, and the anticipated Serbian response, way overdone usually, and then the next cycle and so on. And it was fairly steady. Nothing much changed up till March 1999. Estimates are pretty rough, but it seems that the killings were approximately comparable on both sides. According to the British, during the period up till January, they were mostly KLA, and nothing changed after that. In March, February, there were efforts at negotiations. There were two positions presented. One was NATO, the other was Serbia. Serbian position was never mentioned, just the NATO position. And I think you have to look hard to even find it. I picked it up out of Serbian sources with some friends. But the negotiations broke down. At that point, the U.S., carrying along its NATO allies, decided to move to bombing. The general in charge, General Clark, testified in Washington secretly, but it all came out very soon. He met with high Clinton administration officials, Madeleine Albright, Sandy Berger, National Security Advisor. They asked him what his plans were. He said NATO would bomb. They didn't want to get soldiers on the ground. And he was asked, well, what will the consequences be? He said, well, of course, the Serbs will react on the ground. They can't bomb us, So they'll respond where they're strong, which is on the ground, which means there'll be atrocities and expulsions and so on. And then he was asked, well, what do you do then? He said, well, we bomb some more. That was early March. Anticipating this, the monitors were withdrawn. And I think around March 22nd or 23rd or so, roughly then, the bombing started. Clark right away had a press conference, of course, since the bombing started. He was asked, what's going to happen? They said the same thing. He said, well,
it's predictable, he said, that there will be atrocities on the ground as the Serbian army responds to their bombing of Serbia. I don't even know if that was reported, but and yes, it happened. About a week later, the UN High Commission on Refugees began registering its first refugees. Then came all the horrors on the ground. The bombing went on for 78 days. There was finally a ceasefire and a UN Security Council resolution, which was pretty much a compromise between the two positions of late February, which suggests that there could have been a negotiated settlement. But it's kind of academic because NATO instantly violated the agreement, instantly, with the support of the Western media and so on. And then you, meanwhile, in the middle of all of this, under British and American pressure, the International Court, the criminal court, indicted Milosevic. And it's kind of interesting to look at the indictment. All for crimes committed after the bombing. There's one exception. Even if it's disputed, but maybe it's true. One exception was the Racek killings in January, but everything else was after the bombings. It was plainly just part of the court was simply following orders slavishly from its masters to try to, provide help for their attack. And it was recognized pretty much soon after, that you'd never be able to get away with indicting Milosevic for crimes committed as a result of the NATO bombing. So they added Bosnia to it, and then you get the whole spectacle. Highly, whatever you think about it, it's highly politicized. You can't call it a serious criminal investigation. And and then comes, moves on to the U.S. Imposed independence, not accepted by many countries, incidentally. But the U.S. came out pretty well. They have a major military base in Kosovo. Camp Bondsteel was used all the time. It's just used in bombing of Libya, in fact. And it gives the U.S. a position in the Balkans. It's not just German territory. The U.S. has a position there in Kosovo, which is pretty much a disaster area.
I just wanted to...
I should add that there is a Western religious doctrine on this. Most fanatic in England, much more than in the United States. The religious doctrine, which is catechism they have to repeat, is that the West intervened to stop the atrocities. And the way that's achieved is just by inverting the chronology and suppressing the massive documentation, Western documentation, about what happened up to the bomb and everything else I said. So you just invert that. And then it turns out that the West is the noblest act in human history, humanitarian intervention, intervened to stop the atrocities that were going on. And anyone who questions this is a supporter of the Holocaust. Okay, that ends the discussion. It's amazing in England. It's about as bad in France, what I kind of expected there. Actually, it's less extreme in the United States for once. And this is true on the British left, incidentally. I don't mean right. Just one more point about this. There's an interesting international commission, not formal, run by Justice Goldstone, inquiry into Kosovo, with very good people on it. And the same Goldstone who did the Goldstone report on Gaza, South African jurors. And they came out with an interesting study which concluded that the bombing of Kosovo was illegal but legitimate. And the reason it was legitimate was because it was necessary to make a humanitarian act to stop the atrocities that were going on. Now, if you look at their evidence, it's the same as the catechism. They just invert the chronology. Simple invert the chronology. Well, okay, then maybe make a case.
On this role of Germany in the breakup of Yugoslavia. You mentioned in one interview for Slovenian journal, if I remember correctly, that exactly what you said now, that basically Germany was the chief promoter of Croatian independence, and then the rest of Western Europe, European Union, just followed that path. But what was the main interest of Germany?
Well, to say again, you know, I haven't studied this in depth, so I'm just talking about the way it looks to me.
Yeah.
I think the main Germany has a historic interest in the Balkans. That's part of, you know, when Hitler moved in, that was not an innovation. Germany had been influential there, and I think it was just trying to restore its influence over that part of Europe. Just as Germany's the driving force right now in the austerity programs that are destroying Southern Europe.
How do you see these developments? I will come back later to Yugoslavia territory, but when we speak about this German influence in Europe, how do you see the current political and economic situation in Europe? There is one member of British Parliament who just recently accused basically that Germany wants to dominate and to control the entire Europe, and
it's not a secret. I mean, you know, and that isn't new. It goes back centuries. I mean, the Europeans don't go to war with each other anymore. It's called, in the political science literature, it's called the democratic peace. The democracies don't fight each other. Well, it's true that democracies don't fight each other if they understand that the next time they play their favorite game of slaughtering each other, they're going to destroy the world. So in 1945, you know, a light dawned in Europe. They realized we've been the most savage, brutal place in history for centuries, but we can't do it anymore because the level of capacity for destruction has reached such a level that the next time there's a war between France, Germany, and Italy, it'll follow what Albert Einstein once said. He was asked, what are going to be the weapons used in the next war? And he said, well, I don't know what they'll be, but I know what they'll be in the war after that, stone axes. Yeah, that's, when that realization dawned, they don't fight each other anymore. They carry out atrocities elsewhere. But, so it's now, and a lot of good things have happened. I mean, a lot of the steps toward the European Union, I think, are very sensible. And it became quite a civilized place by comparative standards. But there is a struggle about influence and power and policy and so on. That's to be anticipated. Germany has done very respectably in many ways. It has become kind of what it was like in the 1920s, when Germany was peak of Western civilization. The sciences, the arts, was regarded as a model of democracy. Sank to the utter abyss 10 years later, but it's changed. It's going back to that. It's a very civilized place in many ways. The economy, again, by comparative standards, has been doing quite well. It's the one Western society that has maintained a really well-functioning manufacturing base and export economy and so on. So plenty of favorable things to say. It's shifting to more than most other countries to sustainable energy, you know, and so on. A lot of good things to say, but it does want to maintain the domination of the German financial and industrial sector over Europe as much as possible, and I think that's what drives the economic policies, which, in my opinion, and I'm by no means alone, repeating the opinion of many outstanding economists, I think it's a policy that will simply worsen the crisis. You can't, in the midst of austerity, to pursue a recession. What you need is growth, not austerity. Austerity will make it harder to get out of the recession, harder to pay the debts. We can already see it happening. What you need is a stimulus. Europe has plenty of resources to stimulate the economies. They don't have to, and for them to be borrowing from China and Russia is kind of comical. They have far greater resources, but they have to want to do it. And that has to be a decision of the ECB and the leaders and so on, and they're stuck in it. They have a kind of a mantra. You have to keep inflation below 2%, because remember what happened in 1923, as if that has any relevance. Keeping inflation, there's no signs of inflation, but potential inflation isn't good for bankers and investment firms and so on, so we got to make sure we don't have any threat of that. It is good for debtors and manufacturers and so on, but we don't care much about them. So we'll keep that policy. We'll impose greater austerity. We'll reduce the likelihood of the poorer countries growing out of the recession, which is exactly what's happening. There are differences among them, and Greece is a difficult problem, but take Spain. I mean, its financial situation was quite decent before the collapse of the bubble. It has a manufacturing industry. In fact, it's pretty advanced in many respects. For example, in, say, important things like, say, automation of health services, which is very significant in management of health. Spain is one of the leaders technologically, innovation, and development, and so on. It's a society that could, but it'll be probably crushed by these measures. That's why you have the uprisings, the Indianapolis, and so on. But I think all of this is part of the effort of basically German financial sectors in, first of all, expanding German influence, but also, I think, and probably more significant in my view, just fighting a class war. They never liked the welfare state measures. They don't like the power of labor, such as it is. And these are perfect ways to undermine them.
Do you think that this economic crisis since 2008 can lead, what some people pointed out, to some sort of United States of Europe, so that the government, Central European government, will become stronger, and basically that sovereignty or national states will be to a more significant extent?
Well, that's in fact happened to an extent. So the Schengen agreements to reduce the sovereignty of individual states and lead to a more civilized society. I mean, it's quite nice to be able to go from, Belgium to Austria without crossing borders, stopping it, and many other forms of integration, like educational, cultural, commercial, have been very successful, I think. If there were a move in that direction, I think it'd probably be a good idea. But it could be the opposite. In fact, some very unpleasant things are happening in Europe. There's, let's go back to Germany. I said in the 1920s it was the peak of Western civilization, maybe. By the 1930s it was kind of the depths of human history. Same with individuals, same culture. So Europe has a lot of conflicting strains. And some of the uglier ones are coming out dramatically in Hungary, pretty seriously in Austria, and to an extent in the rest of even countries like Denmark and so on, we would expect.
And just if you could comment on the current situation when it comes to Kosovo independence and Serbian membership to EU. Just in December 2010, European Union denied Serbia status of candidate, and most of the people think that it was Germany who actually vetoed that decision based on the unresolved Kosovo issue. What do you think could be the final solution for that?
For Kosovo?
Yeah.
There was a proposal back in the 90s by a Serbian who I think at the time was president of the Yugoslav Federation, Dobrica,
That was the choice.
Yeah. He proposed a partition of Kosovo, which seemed to me at the time to make some sense.
But now nobody, I mean, the United States and Europe always said
The U.S.
don't go to
because the U.S. likes it the way it is. Kosovo is a client state. As I say, they got this big military base. It's a base for U.S. power. And Europe, well, of course, will go along with it. But something like that would be, I think, a pretty reasonable settlement.
Do you think that Serbia can stay isolated in these EU enlargement processes?
Look, it's very hard even for a country like Greece to survive. Serbia has even more problems. But I think Serbia is just going to be compelled in some fashion to adapt to the great power concentrations.
And to recognize independence, possibly.
I suppose,
Yeah. Thank you so much.